سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له جل. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله عليه الصلاة والسلام. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله صلوات الله عليه وآله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. اللهم اجعل قلبي بارا واملي سارا يعيش بارا رزق دار ولا دبرار وجعل من قبل النبي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم مستقرا وقرارا برحمتك يا رب. صلوا على محمد وعلى محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين الذي بعد فلا يرى وقرب فشهد النجوى. نحمده ونستعينه ونثني عليه ونؤمن به، ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف بريته ومبلغ رسالاته العبد المؤيد الرسول المسدد المحمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. عباد الله، أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله. We begin this first Friday khutbah by reminding all of you and myself to maintain the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We were discussing the chapter on the dedication to the acts of worship, and of those the act of salat. I mentioned this last week, and we took some time discussing this narration that is attributed to our 11th Imam, Al-Imam Hassan al-Askari, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi. which you hear is quoted quite often, and early scholars of ours, the author of At-Tahdhib, Shaykh al-Tusi, has narrated, and other authors have narrated as well. That is, the Imam mentioned that the signs of the believer is 5. But in the same narration where the Imam mentions Ziyaratul Arba'in as one of the 5 signs of the believer, 2 of the other 5 signs that the Imam mentions has to do with salat. And not just the wajib salat. The Imam went a step further and he said that a sign of a believer is not only that he does his wajib salat, in fact he goes beyond that. So the wajib salat is 17 rak'ats in a day. That's not what you find in the narration. The narration didn't say the sign of the believer is 17 rak'ats. The narration says the sign of the believer is 50 rak'ats. Or in some narrations, 51 rak'ats. So that is the nawafil in addition to the wajib prayers, yes? And so we mentioned in the previous khutbah that this is something that in our communities, in our culture, needs to be changed. It needs to be fixed. This lack of emphasis on salat and this emphasis on other teachings of the Ahl Bayt. This is something that we have to have a more balanced approach with regards to. Why did the Ahl Bayt emphasize salat so much? Because they believed that salat had a spiritual reality behind it that will present itself on the day of judgment. This is why we mentioned this verse of the Quran, verse 30 from Surah Ali Imran. يَوْمَ تَجِدُ كُلُّ نَفْسٍ مَا عَمِلَتْ مِنْ خَيْرٍ مُحْضَرًا. The day where every person will see present with him the spiritual realities of his deeds. وَمَا عَمِلَتْ مِنْ سُوءٍ. He will see the good things that he has done. He see the evil things that he's done. When it comes to those evil things, تَوَدُّ لَوْ أَنَّ بَيْنَهَا وَبَيْنَهُ أَمَدًا بَعِيدًا. He wants there to be a long distance between him and these evil deeds. Because before, when he was engaging in them, he didn't realize the reality behind them. He didn't realize their essence. Didn't realize the effect they're having on his soul. All he knew was the marja said this act is haram. But he didn't take seriously the essence and the nature behind that deed. So he said it's haram, it's not a big deal, it's just a haram. No, when Islam considers something haram, that's an indication that the spiritual reality of this deed is evil. This idea that I can spiritually grow and then there's haram in my life at the same time. But this haram is not a big deal. This is not Islamic. It's not an Islamic understanding. Islam said when something's haram, it will tie you down spiritually. You can't go anywhere. So I cry for Imam al-Hussein. Okay, great. But you're not going to be able to go too much. It's going to be very limited. Well, I do this. Okay, great. As long as I have haram in my life, especially that haram that I haven't repented from. Yes? And I'm actively engaging in it. It's just like, part of my 9 to 5 is also this haram. No, I'm not going to be able to go far. Doesn't matter how spiritual I feel. Doesn't matter I sit in the majlis and I cry and these are good things. But at the end of the day, this is going to tie me down. My wings are going to be tied as long as I have haram in my life because these deeds have spiritual realities behind them. And we went through this narration of the Prophet Muhammadin al-Mustafa salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, in which the Prophet explained the spiritual reality behind a number of deeds. And it was a long narration, so we didn't have the opportunity to go through the full narration. I'm going to read some of the other spiritual realities that the Prophet mentions in this narration that Shaykh al-Saduq has narrated. He said, and this was part of the dream that the Prophet had seen, and he was telling his companions. He said, وَرَأَيْتُ رَجُلًا مِّنْ أُمَّتِي. And I saw that there was a man from my ummah, يَلْهَثُ عَتَشًا. He showed up on the day of judgment, and he was thirsty. You know when you're thirsty, you start breathing heavily, yes? Just looking for a little bit of water. يَلْهَثُ عَتَشًا. He was looking for water on this day. كُلَّمَا وَرَدَ حَوْذًا مُنِعَ مِنْهُ. Every time he saw a fountain of water, he wanted to approach the fountain of water, مُنِعَ مِنْهُ. He was sent back. Why? Because he has other sins that don't make him worthy of this. So what came and saved him? What spiritual reality came and saved him in these moments? فَجَاءُهُ صِيَامُ شَهْرِ رَمَضَانِ. His fasting on the day of judgment came forward and allowed him to drink from these fountains. The Prophet is saying this is literally how it plays out on the day of judgment. وَرَأَيْتُ رَجُلًا مِّنْ أُمَّتِي قَدْ هَوَتْ صَحِيفَتُهُ قِبَلَ شِمَالِهِ. And I saw a person from my ummah, his book of deeds was moving towards his left hand. Okay, if it's moving towards your left hand, that's not a good sign. Yes, we call that a red flag. Yes, if it's already on its way to your left hand, that means, yes, someone's in trouble. He said, قَدْ هَوَتْ صَحِيفَتُهُ قِبَلَ شِمَالِهِ, towards his left hand. فَجَاءَهُ. So what came and saved him? Look at this, because in the second khutbah we're going to talk a little bit more about this. What saved this person who his deeds didn't necessarily stack up to what it needed to be, but he had something else with him that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, even though your deeds don't stack up, but this will make up for it. What came and made up for it? فَجَاءَهُ خَوْفُهُ مِنَ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. His fear of Allah. Fear of Allah means what? Means at the end of the day, he knew he committed these sins, yes? But he knew that God has authority over him. Sense of accountability. He understood Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in charge. I've committed these sins. Technically, I'm worthy for punishment. This is khawf. When they say fearing God, they don't mean I go in some corner and my hands are shaking. This is not fear of God. Fear of God means I have a sense of accountability to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. His deeds are not there. But guess what he did have? At the end of the day, he understood Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in charge. He has authority over me. فَجَاءَهُ خَوْفُهُ مِنَ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ فَأَخَذَ صَحِيفَتَهُ فَجَعَلَهَا فِي يَمِينِهِ. The khawf came and took the book of deeds from his left hand, placed it in his right hand. Sense of accountability. وَرَأَيْتُ رَجُلًا مِّنْ أُمَّتِي. And I saw a man from my ummah, قَائِمًا عَلَى شَفِيرِ جَهَنَّمْ. He's about to fall into the hellfire, yes? Shafir is that tip of the cliff where you're standing. Even if you're not careful, you take one step the wrong way, yes, it's a disaster. عَلَى شَفِيرِ جَهَنَّمْ. He's at the very end of the cliff that's going to enter into hellfire. So what came and saved him? فَجَاءَهُ رَجَاؤُهُ مِنَ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. His hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hope means what? Hope means he understood he had certain sins, accountability. But at the end of the day, he said, you're very merciful. You might be able to do something for me on this day. فَجَاءَهُ رَجَاؤُهُ مِنَ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ فَاسْتَنْقَذَهُ مِنْ ذَلِكَ. That saved him. وَرَأَيْتُ رَجُلًا مِّنْ أُمَّتِي. I saw another man from my ummah. قَدْ هَوَى فِي النَّارِ. He's already on his way falling into the hellfire. Hawa means when something falls. So now these other individuals, some of them were on the sirat and some of them were on the tip of the cliff and so on and so forth. This one, Hawa, is already falling into the hellfire. So what saved him? فَجَاءَتْهُ دُمُوعُهُ الَّتِي بَكَى مِنْ خَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ. The tears that he shed in the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the fear of, oh Allah, I've done wrong things. You know, I can be held accountable for these. That's it. This is what saved him on that day. Yes? And then I'll move on, inshallah, to the last line that the Prophet mentions. He says, وَرَأَيْتُ رَجُلًا مِّنْ أُمَّتِي إِنْتَهَا إِلَىٰ أَبْوَابِ الْجَنَّةِ. I saw a man from my ummah. He had now made his way all the way to the doors of heaven. كُلَّمَا انْتَهَا إِلَىٰ بَابٍ أُغْلِقَ دُونَهُ. Every time he came to one of the doors, because the narrations tell us that heaven has multiple doors. It's not one door. Every time he made his way to one of those doors, the door was closed upon him. So what came and saved him in those moments? فَجَاءَتْهُ شَهَادَةُ أَنْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ صَادِقًا بِهَا. His shahada and his belief in one God, because he was sincere about that, that is what came and saved him. فَفُتِحَتْ لَهُ الْأَبْوَابِ. So the gates of heaven were opened to him. وَدَخَلَ الْجَنَّةِ. And he entered into heaven. Take this principle that the Prophet is introducing to us. Apply it to every little thing that you and I do. Every little thing that you and I do in our day-to-day life. It has a spiritual reality behind it. We can't underestimate these things. Oh, it's not a problem. I just said this and I broke her heart. No, that has a spiritual reality behind it. You will deal with the spiritual reality of what you did. Oh, I just opened my mouth and I said a couple sentences. No, that backbiting has a spiritual reality behind it. Some of these the Ahl Bayt have shared with us. The Quran has shared with us. Many of them, they have not shared with us. All they told us was that the spiritual reality of this deed is like a punishment. And you will deal with that unless you disconnect yourself from that deed. And how easy is that? That is only done through the tawbah that the human being does. Therefore, every act of worship has its own spiritual reality. The author of 40 hadith now moves on. He says the other impact of the acts of worship is the sense of fulfillment that it brings the human being. Yes? And there is nothing, brothers and sisters, and today the world is a crazy world, yes? Everybody has their concerns. Everyone has their worries. Everybody has those things that keeps them up at night. The only thing that Quran and Hadith teaches us that will be able to bring my heart a little bit of calm, a little bit of tranquility, is my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Otherwise, if I try to go at the difficulties of life on my own, it'll be too much. This person says one thing, that person says another thing. This one messes with your reputation. This one wants to mess with your business. This is how life is. This is the reality of life. Only thing that can keep me grounded at the end of the day is my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the way to do that is salat. The most important way to do that is salat. There's other pieces to this puzzle, but this is the most important piece to this puzzle. Then you find the sense of fulfillment that the Ahlul Bayt had, yes? Where did they get this sense of fulfillment? Their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When difficulties came their way, they were bothered by them. But it made it digestible for them, made it tolerable for them. They were able to deal with these difficulties to a certain extent. This is why I want to share this narration that Abdullah ibn Abbas, the famous Ibn Abbas, companion of the Prophet, shares in his conversation with the first Imam, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. This, of course, is on the way, this conversation is on the way towards the Battle of Jamal. When did the Battle of Jamal take place? This is the first battle of the first Imam. So now after 25 years of waiting to come into Khilafah, the Imam has finally come into this position, and before you know it, there's a battle starting. Except the difference between this battle and the other battles is that the battles before this were all between Muslimin and Kuffar. This battle is now internal. This is Muslims against Muslims, or at least those who claim to be Muslim against Muslims, yes? This is a big problem. So now the Imam is on his way towards Basra. And on his way towards Basra, they stopped in a station called Dhiqar. And this is where that conversation took place between Ibn Abbas. And this narration, it highlights that sense of fulfillment, that sense of calm, that sense of needlessness that the first Imam felt when it came to the ups and downs of this world. This world and this life has a lot of ups and downs. If you don't have something to ground you, it will drive you crazy. It'll be too much. So, Ibn Abbas says, دَخَلْتُ عَلَى أَمِيرِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ بِذِيقَار. We stopped in the station of Dhiqar, and I entered upon him. That means I entered into his tent. وَهُوَ يَخْسِفُ نَعْلَهُ. Yes? And he was patching up his sandals, that which he wears. Of course, this is Khalifa. Yes? But he was patching up his own sandals. وَهُوَ يَخْسِفُ نَعْلَهُ. فَقَالَ لِي. So he turned to me and he said, مَا قِيمَةُ هَذَا النَّعْلِ. He said, what's the value of this sandal that I'm patching up? Yes? And Ibn Abbas, of course, saw a sandal that's already been patched up before and is being patched up again. So he says, فَقُلْتُ لَا قِيمَةَ لَهَا. It has no value. Because, these are not even new sandals. These are sandals been patched up so many times, and now you're patching them up again, and la qimata laha. They have no value. So what did the Imam say? The Imam said, فَقَالَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامُ وَاللَّهِ, by Allah, لَهِيَ أَحَبُّ إِلَيَّ مِنْ أَمْرَتِكُمْ. This sandal has more value in my eyes than the position of Khilafah. What does that mean? That means the position of Khilafah is not worth anything in my eyes. position of Khilafah, brothers and sisters, you and I don't even know what that means. Back in the day, you're Khalifa, that means anything you say goes. Khalifa means you're in charge of everything. And the first Imam, while he's on his way to go to deal with those who have started a riot against him, yes, on his way, he said, none of this is worth anything. This sense of fulfillment, this sense of needlessness. Now, you and I, if they told us, forget about Khilafah, if we're going to give you 1/10 of Khilafah, we would come, we would ruin reputations for it, we would ruin lives for it, we would take wealth from other people for it, we would do anything for it. We have this sense of, I need that. Unless I get that, it's not going to work. He said, all of this is worth less in my eyes compared to this sandal. So, oh Ali, why are you going on this trip anyways? If you don't care at all, why even bother yourself? He said, إِلَّا أَنْ أُقِيمَ حَقًّا أَوْ أَدْفَعَ بَاطِلًا. So you know why I'm on this trip? Because what I do get out of going on this trip, going against them in this war, is that I will be able to bring some justice and remove some falsehood from this world. Now this is the first Imam. You and I can never reach this point. You and I never reach this level, yes? But what if I took a little bit of this lesson of the life of the Imam? I dedicated some time to worship. I built this relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I felt a little bit sense of needlessness towards the ups and downs of life. This changes life altogether. Makes the difficulties of life bearable and digestible. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us amongst those who reach this level of maturity to have a sense of needlessness towards the dunya. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين أثني عليه حامدا وأذكره مسبحا ثم أصلي وأسلم على نجيبه وجليله وحافظ سره الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرضين بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. اللهم صل وسلم على علي أمير المؤمنين وفاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين وعلى سبطي نبي الرحمة وإمامي الهدى الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة وعلى علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والخلف الهادي المهدي حججك على عبادك وأمنائك في أرضك صلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات عباد الله أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله. We remind all of you and myself to maintain the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We reached verses 29 and 30 from Surah Qaf. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, after looking at this person who had animosity towards God, who was an enemy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not a person who's a believer and has shortcomings, a person who has animosity towards God, the Quran said his hisab is very easy. Al-qiya fi jahannam, throw him into hellfire. There's no ifs and buts here. There's no discussion and let's see what you did. And no, this is your place is in hellfire. You have to deal with hellfire. The verse said, مَا يُبَدَّلُ الْقَوْلُ لَدَيَّ. The promise that I gave, that the person who comes to the day of judgment like this is going to deal with the hellfire. مَا يُبَدَّلُ الْقَوْلُ لَدَيَّ. It doesn't change. There's no tabdil. There's no showing up to the day of judgment and God taking back His word. No, this is the promise I made from the very beginning, so this is not going to change. وَمَا أَنَا بِظَلَّامٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ. But I don't do injustice to anybody. This is what this person is worthy of. Number one. Number two, he knew this was going to happen. He clearly knew this is what was going to happen. It's not the type of person, he didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't know about Islam. He didn't know about religion. He didn't know about faith. And then he shows up to the day of judgment And they say, well, hellfire. He says, well, I didn't know about this. No. This is not the person the Quran is referring to. He knew exactly where he was headed. مَا يُبَدَّلُ الْقَوْلُ لَدَيَّ. I don't change that promise. And we said from this verse of the Quran, we understand what? We understand that the Quran has made it clear. The one who fundamentally turns away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this person definitely is going to deal with the hellfire. There's no doubt about that in the verses of the Quran. Okay, great. What about all the other people? What about people who either they weren't presented the truth, or like you and I, they were presented the truth, and they accepted the truth, but they had shortcomings in their day-to-day life. The Quran said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ أَن يُشْرَكَ بِهِ. God does not forgive shirk. If I show up with shirk on the day of judgment, God doesn't forgive this. وَيَغْفِرُ مَا دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَن يَشَاءُ. But He potentially could forgive anything else. Potentially. Potentially means I can't sit there and say, well, alhamdulillah, potentially we're fine. Potentially you're fine is not enough. Yes? I had a sister once ask me, says, Sheikh, is this particular deed, action, a sin? I said, yeah, it's a sin. She said, okay, so is it guaranteed that if I commit this sin, I'll enter hellfire? I said, no, it's not guaranteed. Someone who commits this sin is worthy of punishment, but now they have to do hisab for him, and there's a lot of other factors. She said, alhamdulillah, so it's not guaranteed. I said, yes, it's not guaranteed, but I don't think that's what you want to aim for. I don't think you and I want to aim for, potentially we have to deal with hellfire. That's not good enough. So the Quran said, the rest, potentially we could forgive any portion of it for anybody. This vagueness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put for purpose. Because had He made it any easier, I'm not going to wake up for Fajr anymore. I'm not going to take care of my dress code anymore. I'm not going to do my duties anymore. Yes? So brothers and sisters, in Islam, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you and I is a sense of accountability. Accountability is very important. As long as I understand that my deeds have consequences, I'm not an outlaw. I don't get to do whatever I like. The moment I recognize this, the doors of God's mercy opens upon me. The one who doesn't recognize God's authority, has no accountability, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not love this person. And His mercy is not going to come to save this person. The one who gives himself a green light, yes, salat not important. Dress code not important. Fasting not important. Doesn't matter. He doesn't care about this stuff. This person is far from God's mercy. You know who's close to God's mercy? The person who says, salat is important because He said so, but I have some shortcomings. I fall short sometimes, yes? This person's close to the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why we read, I want to share this beautiful narration from the 6th Imam, Al-Imam As-Sadiq, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. This is that khawf and raja that we were talking about yesterday, yes? Have a sense of accountability and God's mercy opens up upon you. The 6th Imam said, Man adhnaba dhanban, the one who commits a sin, fa'alima, but he knows, anna Allaha muttali'un alayh, that God is watching him. He understands and recognizes God's authority. So he committed the sin, but فَعَلِمَ أَنَّ اللَّهَ مُطَّلِعٌ عَلَيْهِ. He knows that God is watching him. إِنْ شَاءَ عَذَّبَهُ وَإِنْ شَاءَ غَفَرَ لَهُ. So because he knows God is watching him, he just has a moment of thought that this deed that I did, God can hold me accountable to it if He wants to. The Imam said, if he has this level of accountability, غُفِرَ لَهُ. He is forgiven. I mean, what else are we asking for? Did Islam come and tell us, be perfect. If you're not perfect, you have to go to hellfire? This is not what Islam taught us. Did Islam come and say, you miss one salat, now you have to deal with hellfire? This is not what Islam taught us. Islam said, have a sense of accountability and God's mercy opens upon you. Yes, any version of Islam that doesn't build a sense of accountability in me is a fake version of Islam. Doesn't mesh with the Quran. Doesn't mesh with the words of the Ahl Bayt. This idea of Islam that, listen, this prayer doesn't matter. This fasting doesn't matter. Dress code doesn't matter. Eating halal doesn't matter. These things don't matter. As long as your heart is pure, everything else is fine. This is not Islam. Now, if someone wants to practice this, that's fine. Don't call it Islam though. This is your version of living life. That's okay. Everyone's free to practice however they like. But don't call this Islam. This doesn't mesh with Islam. Islam said these things are important. You have to try your best. But guess what? If you fall short, that's why you have a merciful Lord. That's why you have Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. That's why the narration said, the moment you recognize that what I did was wrong, and God has the authority to hold me accountable, غُفِرَ لَهُ. Yes? You are now forgiven. Why? Because you built a sense of accountability within yourself. This is what the Quran teaches us. It said if you show up with shirk, yes, this is definitely you're in trouble. Anything less than that, let's see what we can do for you. Now let's see what we can do for you. It's not that God doesn't know how to deal with you. He knows exactly what to do. But He kept that vagueness there because if He came out and said, yes, this is forgiven, that is forgiven, then you and I wouldn't do anything. He has to keep us between this khawf and this raja constantly. Yes? This is what we understand from the verses of the Quran. That's why I mentioned this a couple of days ago. If you were taught, brothers and sisters, if this was my understanding of Islam growing up, that God is waiting every second for me to fail, to send His punishment, to burn me, to do this. Well, you were taught religion wrong. This is not what Islam preaches. It's not the message of Ahl Bayt. And at the same time, if I was taught religion in the sense that rules and regulations don't matter, you can do as you wish as long as generally you're a good person, well, then you were also taught religion wrong. Neither of these represents Islam's take on this issue, yes? You say, what is Islam's take? Islam's take is take accountability, recognize that He is in charge, and then God's mercy opens up to you. What is there greater that I'm sitting there and I think of a sin that I did, and I say, Ya Allah, I know I committed this sin. You have authority over me. You can hold me accountable if you like. And the sixth Imam said, غُفِرَ لَهُ. It's already forgiven. This is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is why the Quran says in the verses that we'll discuss inshallah in the next khutbah, وَأُزْلِفَتِ الْجَنَّةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ غَيْرَ بَعِيدٍ. We bring heaven to the muttaqeen. Why does God bring heaven to the muttaqeen? We're going to talk about this. But who are these muttaqeen? Who are these God-fearing people? Are they people who walk on clouds and they never make a mistake and they never do anything wrong? No, no, no. This is not the muttaqeen that the Quran is referring to. The Quran says there are muttaqeen, they make mistakes. They commit sins. Except what they do is, they always return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a very doable bar Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set for us, yes? It's very doable. I can't be perfect, but I can have the decency and the sincerity that when I fall short, I return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the merciful Lord that we have, brothers and sisters, yes? So in the following verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will speak about those who fall short, but they return to Him, and He calls them muttaqi. Calls them God-fearing. God-fearing isn't the one who's always perfect. It's the one who always comes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, the one who doesn't come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, this person is going to have to deal with the consequences of his deeds. The one who sits there and smiles as if nothing is wrong in the world, yes? Even though he or she is part of the genocide that's happening. Yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to hold this person accountable. Yes, this person is going to burn in hellfire, definitely. Who else would burn in hellfire? The Quran said, يَوْمَ نَقُولُ لِجَهَنَّمْ. When we turn to hellfire, we say, هَلِمْ تَلَأْتِ. Are you full? The Quran says that hellfire responds, هَلْ مِن مَزِيدٍ. Do you have anybody else? Why? Because this is a person who had animosity towards God. Sure, you can sit there and smile. You know, one of these new nominees that's being presented now is being presented as the moderate version. Yes? Because the reality is what's happening in Palestine is probably going to come to a ceasefire during the presidency of the next president, naturally, yes? Probably not going to continue for another 5 years. We all know this. Okay, so if this Democratic nominee comes, now she's going to be presented as the moderate one. No, you were the vice president for so many years. You were the vice president for 10 months of this genocide. So the point is, brothers and sisters, you and I, we can smile and present ourselves however we want to present ourselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at our deeds, yes? This is why a person who doesn't care about the lives of others. If someone comes and disrupts her, she says, listen, I know children are getting blown apart. I know they're losing limbs, and I know this is happening, but please be quiet, I'm speaking right now. Now you can smile and present yourself in a very appealing way. It doesn't change who you are. And this is why the Quran brings up the Day of Judgment constantly. Because these individuals who can try to trick millions, and when people hear his name or her name, they cheer with the loudest of their voices, they can do that in this world. On the Day of Judgment, none of this works anymore. On the Day of Judgment, you have to answer for the blood that's on your hands. On the Day of Judgment, you have to answer for those bombs that you gave to other people. On the Day of Judgment, you have to answer for the funding that you did. People say, what do we live in America? What do we have to do with that? Our country is funding this. Our country is funding this. Our country is the biggest funder of all of this. Of course it has to do with me. And so this person comes and says, oh, please be quiet, I'm speaking. Well, I don't care if you're speaking. There are children dying. This is what happens, brothers and sisters, when there is no sense of accountability. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold anybody who has no sense of accountability to Him accountable on the Day of Judgment. Either you hold yourself accountable, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold you accountable. These are the two options that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided to us. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. صلى الله عليه وسلم. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. صلى الله عليه وسلم. وأن عليا حجة الله صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض الملك القدوس العزيز الحكيم. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. وآخرين منهم لما يلحقوا بهم وهو العزيز الحكيم. ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا بئس مثل القوم الذين كذبوا بآيات الله والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. قل يا أيها الذين هادوا إن زعمتم أنكم أولياء لله من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين ولا يتمنونه أبدا بما قدمت أيديهم والله عليم بالظالمين. قل إن الموت الذي تفرون منه فإنه ملاقيكم ثم تردون إلى عالم الغيب والشهادة فينبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. فإذا قضيت الصلاة فانتشروا في الأرض وابتغوا من فضل الله واذكروا الله كثيرا لعلكم تفلحون. وإذا رأوا تجارة أو لهوا انفضوا إليها وتركوك قائما. قل ما عند الله خير من اللهو ومن التجارة والله خير الرازقين. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. بسم الله وبالله الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. لا إله إلا الله العظيم الحليم. لا إله إلا الله رب العرش الكريم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم إني أسألك موجبات رحمتك وعزائم مغفرتك والغنيمة من كل بر والسلامة من كل إثم. اللهم لا تدع لي ذنبا إلا غفرته ولا هما إلا فرجته ولا سقما إلا شفيته ولا عيبا إلا سترته ولا رزقا إلا بسطته ولا خوفا إلا آمنته ولا سوءا إلا صرفته ولا حاجة هي لك رضا ولي فيها صلاح إلا قضيتها يا أرحم الراحمين. آمين رب العالمين. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أحسن.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. اللهم صل على محمد وأن عليا حجة الله صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. يا محسن قد أتاك المسيء وقد أمرت المحسن أن يتجاوز عن المسيء أنت المحسن وأنا المسيء فبحق محمد وآل محمد صل على محمد وآل محمد وتجاوز عن قبيح ما تعلم مني. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وتقبل شفاعته وارفع درجته. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. بسم الله وبالله الحمد لله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ما شاء الله لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Inshallah, recite Dua Wahdat all together. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لا إله إلا الله إلها واحدا ونحن له مسلمون. لا إله إلا الله ولا نعبد إلا إياه مخلصين له الدين ولو كره المشركون. لا إله إلا الله ربنا ورب آبائنا الأولين. لا إله إلا الله وحده وحده أنجز وعده ونصر عبده وعز جنده وهزم الأحزاب وحده. فله الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت ويميت ويحيي وهو حي لا يموت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك يا رسول الله. السلام عليك يا حبيب الله. السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب. السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله الحسين. السلام على 9 المعصومين من ذرية الحسين. السلام عليك يا صاحب العصر والزمان. السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليكم يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على